What I'm going to talk about today is really, it's going to be a real overview. I want to explain why some of you who may think, oh, plants boring, I hopefully want to persuade you that there is enough about plants to actually you to have an interest in plant fossils and what they can tell us. Okay, so crashing on. If I can get the slide, there we go. So what can these old bits of dead plants tell us? I'm going to speak a little bit about the big picture and the sort of stuff you might expect me to say about what plants can tell us about how they've evolved. I'm going to explain a little bit of the basics. So apologies if there are people there who are, already know this stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of plant fossils and what they can tell us, and the sort of questions that they can help us to answer as well. And finally, I'm going to end on a little bit about how people talk about plants and fossils and what that can tell us about us actually and our perceptions of the world. So crashing on. In terms of popular perceptions, there's not a lot to go on. If you know a bit about paleontology, you might know that there are famous palaeobotanists, people like this slightly controversial figure, Mary Stopes. Before she studied birth control and things, she was a paleobotanist first. However, in the popular consciousness, there is one paleobotanist out there, and it is, of course, Ellie Sattler from Jurassic Park. So in some ways, the popular representation that we've got is at least it's not Ross from Friends, we've got a little bit of representation. And I was delighted yesterday, I got a new hoodie, and look at that, paleobotanist. It's the first time I've ever felt, the popular culture was on my side. So I was really chuffed to get that. So that's the popular conception, if there is one at all, of what paleobotany is. It's someone who knows about plants from the past. So when we want to think about what we know about plants, so our planet today is dominated by one plant group. It's the plants that we eat. It's the plants that surround us in most of our environments. So everything from the fields of wheat that we see growing through to the big mighty oak trees that we might see, even conkers, things like that, the pretty flowers that people find aesthetically pleasing. These are all angiosperms. That's the flowering plants. And apart from certain ecosystems, they dominate our planet and they're hugely important to us. However, these flowering plants are a really recent, and by recent I mean 100 million years and a bit, they're recent. And the plants that were around us before that are still around us today. So if you went out of your house, went down the road, depending on where you live, you might see some of these plants. Some of them you wouldn't, unless you're like me and you have a Jurassic garden. But everywhere you'll find moss. So moss is a plant. It's a plant that doesn't have all the plumbing that bigger plants have, but they are still there, what we call non-vascular plants, and liverworts as well. You'll find them virtually everywhere. Everywhere you've got a little damp patch, you'll find liverworts living. Things like club mosses. So that's a picture of a plant called Selaginella. Again, these plants are hugely important when we look at the fossil record, but they're still around us today. Horsetails, a plant that in the UK dominates places where you've got scrubby land and railway sidings, places like that. And if you have the misfortune to have horsetails growing in your garden, equisetum is another name for this. You have my condolences, because they have underground rhizomes and you're really going to have trouble getting rid of them. I've got them in my garden, but they're in a double pot for security. Ferns are beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, and again, an ancient plant group. And then, so all of these plants that I've talked about so far are plants that they don't have seeds, they don't have flowers, they are plants that reproduce using spores. So that's a really ancient method by which plants have reproduced and spread and all over the planet. The last three pictures there are to represent the seed plants. So you've got, you'll all be familiar with conifers, things like Christmas trees, spruces, pines. That one there is a Norfolk Island pine, which isn't a pine, it's actually an Araucaria, same family as the monkey fossil. You've also got things like cycads, these tropical plants there. You've got things like the beautiful ginkgo tree, which I will talk about probably at length because I'm like that. These are seed plants, but their seed isn't fully enclosed within a carpel. So these are naked seeds, gymnosperms is what people would call them. So these plants are still around us. We mostly spend our time eating and observing flowering plants, but all of these ancient groups of plants are still, some of them are more endangered than others. Ginkgo is hanging on, is a great survivor. It's the last Ginkgophyte left. Ginkgo biloba there, that one single species, but they are still around us. And so ignore most of the complicated detail on this slide. What I want you to take home from it is this is the typical story that if a paleontologist was telling you that story of what has happened through deep time to life, they would tell you this story. So across the bottom of the slide there, you've got from left to right, you've got millions of years coming up to present day. And up the side, you've got the number of families. And this is for marine animals. So this is things living in the sea where we've got a nice fossil record. This is the story you would tell. So you've got diversity through time, and you've got these big, where you have a sudden spike downwards, you have an extinction, a mass extinction event. So we have these big 5 mass extinctions. Of course, we're in the 6th mass extinction right now. But this is the typical story you would be told. This is the pattern of life that we're all familiar with. If you look at the plants, though, we have a different story. Plants are really resilient. Plants do things in a different way. So again, we've got the number of families at the side on this slide, and across the bottom there, you've got the same pattern. But we're starting with the Cellular. So we're starting about 400 million years ago on this slide. And you can see you've got these waves of different groups of plants appearing. I'll explain what all this means as we go through. But what I want you to take home from this is that you don't have those mass extinctions. You don't have that sudden disappearance of huge swathes of plant diversity. Plants have slowly and steadily increased their diversity. And then when you get, as you can see on the slide, when you get into the start of the Cretaceous, that huge high slope, that takeoff of diversity, that's the appearance of the flowering plants. That's that modern group suddenly appearing. Darwin called this an abominable mystery. And it's still a bit of a mystery, that sudden takeoff. Was the group already there for longer in the fossil records? That argument carries on, and we still haven't got to the bottom of that. But whatever happens in terms of the appearance of that group, it took off really quickly, and we ended up with this huge diversity. There's 300,000 species of flowering plants, give or take a few thousand today. So this is a different story, and it has a very different pattern. If some of you, are thinking, oh, and there is a little bit of a dent at the biggest mass extinction, I won't deny it, at the end of the Permian. But if you're thinking about the end Cretaceous events, look at this graph. From diversity, it doesn't seem to have really affected plants at all. Anyway, so that's the sort of the backstory. This is what plants have done through deep time. They're resilient. They have shown a pattern of mostly diversification. And as different groups have appeared, they've outcompeted other groups and have risen, like the angiosperms, to prominence. So if we skip back to the start of that graph, about 400 million years ago, you've got the very first plants beginning to make a living on land. We think that they evolved from freshwater algae. There's various different groups of algae that we might think that is happening with. And this is one of the really important bits of our story. We have rocks preserved from a little village near Aberdeen, a little bit to the west of Aberdeen, called Rhynie. And in those fossils, which we think were preserved in an environment similar to the picture on the right, which is from Yellowstone Park. If you're familiar with that bit of the US, you've got these hydrothermal pools. You've got geysers sending mineralized fluids up, hot mineralized fluids, And you can see there that actually you've got a lot of these small plants, things like the mosses that I was talking about, making a living in that environment where other plants cannot. Similarly, about 400 million years ago, you had some of the first land plants doing that as well. So on that slide there, that scale bar is probably about I think it's probably a centimetre. So you've got this lovely silicified, so preserved by this mineral rich fluids, sort of gellifying and then becoming a rock quite quickly. And so if you look at the detail that we can get from that, oh yeah, it says scale bar is 1 centimetre. There you go. You get this cell level preservation. I mean, this is cell biology from 400 million years ago. So if we slice up the Rhyniophytes, grind it down so that we can shine light through it and put it under a light microscope, that's what you'll see. So we can say all sorts of things about the anatomy of plants from 400 million years ago from preservation like this, which I still find is extraordinary. And if you look to the right there, we've got diverse plants. It's not just the simplest ones. So look at A there, you've got a plant that basically has the simplest model you can imagine. It has branches that then dichotomously branch again. And then at the tops of those branches, you have little spore sporangia, little cases for spores where they're produced. So, and no proper root systems. What you've got are these little rhizoid kind of things that we see in modern liverworts. So 400 million years ago, the Rhyniophytic, if we want to give this timing a name, we have plants doing extraordinary things, and we already have diverse plants, and we already have some plants that have worked out how to have that plumbing, having the xylem and phloem. Those words are probably familiar from a classroom a long time ago, or you might be learning about it now. Some plants were already evolving a vascular system, which, if you're a plant, allows you to move water and move sugars around your entire body, and it means that you can be bigger. So that's really cool too. So we're moving forward in time. We're now about 300 million years ago, and this is a display that's in National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. By 300 million years ago, forests have been a thing for millions of years. And in the Carboniferous period, which we're now in, you have huge, enormous forests across most of the Northern Hemisphere, laying down huge amounts of biomass. These trees, when I talked about those different types of plants that we have around us today, I talked a little bit about club mosses, that plant Selaginella, that little plant. If you go back to the Carboniferous swamp forests, you have club mosses that are growing to be trees about 50 meters tall. We have these wonderful root systems that we can see, and they've got those dichotomously branching roots that we can see there on that lovely restoration here. You've got other spore producing plants in tree forms, things like the equisetum, the horsetail that I showed you there, they're tree forms as well. You've got ferns. You've also got the very first seed plants, so the first plants that have worked out that encapsulating your reproductive things in a coat, and being able to spread those is a really sort of clever way of doing it. But these are spore plant dominated forests, and there was all that material eventually getting buried before and just outpacing everything decaying. And that's what created the coal that then, skip back to now, drove our industrial revolution and our culture and our economy. And we're only just working out how that we might not do things that way. But it all boils down to fossil plants. It's all about the plants, the way that our society functions. The history of it is from the fossils. So that was the Palaeophytic. If we move into the Mesozoic, so we have beautifully preserved plant material from the Mesozoic. These are, so this is Jurassic. It's not from the Dorset Jurassic coast. It's from the Yorkshire Jurassic coast. So these are some beautiful ginkgo leaves. I've already mentioned ginkgo as a tree. You have these leaf folds and you have this beautifully preserved material. And if you look there, so that for comparison, that is a ginkgo tree. That's on the University of Nottingham's University Park site. That's the Life Sciences building in the background. I have to say hello to this tree every time I'm on campus. Just go and check on it. It's so beautiful. But the leaves that you can see on that slab there from Yorkshire, they're more or less identical in terms of morphology, so what their shape and form, to the leaves of a modern Ginkgo biloba tree. That means that we can use it to make some really interesting comparisons, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. So this is another type of preservation. This is where you have a leaf that has been compressed, and it's not just an impression. We still have some of the original leaf material there. It's been changed through time, but we have material there that can tell us some really quite cool things. And if we move a little bit further forward, again, not too far from Lyme Regis and not too far from Dorset, if we cross the Solent and we go to the Isle of Wight, so we're now in the lower Cretaceous, if you look at the cliffs on Brook Bay, and within those cliffs, it's difficult to make them out on that picture, but we have plant debris beds. So that ginkgo leaf that you saw there, that lovely preserved thing from Yorkshire, if you go to the Isle of Wight, you won't find nice fossils like that. What you will find is stuff that looks like bottled tea leaves. It's ground up, broken up leaf litter from storm events. And in the same beds, you'll find little bits of dinosaur bone, as well as the more spectacular finds from the Isle of Wight, which if you go to Dinosaur Isle Museum, you'll be able to see some of them. But you find those little bits of bone, there's footprints as well. That's a 7-year-old child for scale. You'll find the footprints on the same beach, but it's those plant debris beds that I'm interested in, because you can scoop out those broken up fragments of leaf material. So again, back to the plants, a little bit of a reminder. This is a cross section through a modern plant leaf. And you can see that you've got that layer of cells, that palisade layer that's doing all the photosynthesis. And you've got guard cells there, and at the bottom you've got that stoma. So stomata, the plural, they're what the plant uses to release the oxygen can go out, the CO2 can get in, so the plant can use it. And they're also there, they also control water loss from the plant as well, because plants need water. You all know this. Another thing that's there to prevent water loss on the plant, and also to protect it from UV light as well, to a certain extent, is this layer on top of this, the cuticle. The plant cuticle is a waxy polymer layer, and it's there to protect the outer layer of the leaf. Luckily for people like me, it's also really, really resistant. So in the right conditions, it fossilizes really, really well. So the rest of this leaf will disappear, but you will still have this waxy layer preserved. And as you can see at the bottom there, that waxy layer encompasses things like the stomata, those holes that tell us about gaseous exchange that the plant's doing at that time. So you can take that, let's see if my little video will work. You can take some of that plant material from the Cretaceous rocks of the Isle of Wight. This bit's a bit scrappy. There are much prettier bits, but you can see those rows of stomata on a conifer from 130 million years ago. It's from an extinct family of conifers, so we don't have any modern representations for this one, this Pseudophrenolopsis parthenomosa. And don't try and say that too quickly. This plant dominated those plant debris beds that you can see on the Isle of Wight. It's everywhere. There are other plants. If you move enough bits of the leaves, fragments from this plant out of the way, you can find other things in there as well. So it's a really nice way of studying plants. Being able to see their stomata can tell us things about that plant's physiology when it was alive. So again, back to Ginkgo biloba, one of my favourite trees. If we look in the English Wealden, which is the rocks, these early Cretaceous rocks from the Isle of Wight, you can see these are pictures from an electron microscope as well as light microscope of the details of those gas pores, those stomata in the leaves. And if you look at how they're arranged, and the density of those, that can tell you things. You can plug that into equations and it can tell you things about CO2 levels in the past. You can actually calibrate it because we've got modern representatives. So it means that you can use these plants to actually tell us something about past climates. They're not just telling us about the history of a particular plant group, they're telling us about climate change and atmospheric changes through deep time, which I think is really quite astonishing and useful. Because if we're going to understand climate change, we need to have that big picture, that context, in order to understand what's happening now. So there you go. Plant fossils aren't just telling us about evolution, they are exquisitely tuned climate sensors. So if you want to know why plant fossils are useful, this is what I would say. They are climate sensors scattered through deep time that can tell us these wonderful things. Okay, so if we take that and stick it all together, so just for completeness, if you want to have an idea of what those plant debris beds could tell us about that bit of Dorset and the Isle of Wight in the early Cretaceous, you would have this. You would have uplands covered with these forests of conifers, you would have ferns, you would have ginkgos, you would have climbing cycads of all things, benetites, an ancient group, another group of sea plants that are extinct now. And you would have this lush vegetation which would support herbivores, which of course are then supporting, if you think about what you know about ecosystems and how we have food pyramids, you'd eventually be supporting top predators at the top of that system. But in order to do that, you need this huge biomass. If you've got herds of mega herbivores moving through the landscape, eating everything in their path, you're going to have a rapidly replacing vegetation. Okay, so as well as thinking about plants in terms of what they can tell us about climates, we can also look at what these fossils can tell us about co-evolution, about how plants and animals evolve together in arms races, if you like, through time. So this reconstruction that you can see here, you might just glance at that and think, oh, well, that's a butterfly and a flower. It's not a butterfly and it's not a flower. What you've got here is it's actually, so there's a group of insects that are around today. Again, I could go and find one in my garden called lacewings. What this is a Jurassic lacewing from a group called the Calligrammatids. And if you look, you've got the fossil in the top left there of this particular insect, and you've got a modern butterfly underneath. There's convergent evolution here, really close convergence between the lacewings and modern angiosperm pollinators, so flowering plant pollinators, butterflies. And I've already mentioned this group, the benetites. So this plant isn't a flowering plant, it's a benetite. This is a plant, a seed plant that had evolved structures which aren't flowers, they're flower-like in some ways, and they require pollination. And so we can begin to think about these ideas of having certain insect groups and certain seed plant groups have already evolved these close pollination relationships before we had flowers. So actually there's lots of debate about how flowers, I've already said, how they came to dominate the planet. Some of those evolutionary partnerships were already in place in the Jurassic, but it wasn't with flowering plants. It was with different groups of plants, and it was with different groups of insects. And yeah, I mean, that fossil, I still find it, you know, look at that, it's not a butterfly. It's a different group of insects doing exactly the same thing in this extraordinary convergent evolution. So that's another thing that we can take from plant fossils. We can look at those co-evolutionary partnerships. I've already talked a little about this, but I want to unpack it a little bit more. So we are really lucky that for plants, because of the way that they're stuck together, their cells, and that they have these sturdy plant cell walls, and also just we are lucky with modes of preservation. What that means is actually we have cell biology through the past as well. So this is a different type. So I talked about the Rhyniophytes and that we had silicified preservation, which means that we have that cell detail in there. We also have it in sometimes from the Carboniferous as well. So these are concretions. These are bits of beds in the coal measures. So where coal is formed, you get these concretions, these calcium carbonate concretions that do the same thing. They preserve cell level preservation. So here's one of the typical museum or university collection slides. So again, in the same way, if you slice up a coal ball, you can then grind it down so you can shine light through it. You can put it under a light microscope and you can look at this cell level preservation from plants from the coal measures. So a lot of these slides were made in Victorian times when people were discovering these plants for the first time and actually trying to work out what was going on. You've got all this anatomical detail, but it's in slices. So actually working out what these plants look like. In the days before, you could just plug it into a computer and say, okay, stick all these slices together. That was no mean feat, actually. So if you look at these, you can actually find some really interesting patterns. And my colleague, Sandy Hetherington, who's now based in Edinburgh, at Edinburgh University, if you dig into what they can tell you, so you can see this is the tip of a growing plant root, okay? And you can actually see all those cells. You can measure the cell dimensions. That can tell you stuff about, so plants have growing tips, so meristems. So there's one at the root and there's a meristem at the shoot. Those meristems are where there's rapidly dividing cells. It's the plant equivalent of stem cells. So by measuring the pattern of these cells, it can actually tell us whether we've got an active meristem, whether we've got plant stem cells in action. By the pattern of the shape and the measurements, we can say this was an active meristem, which I actually find to be absolutely astonishing that we can do that from something 300 million years ago. From this work, Sandy and his colleagues actually showed that probably not only are there different anatomies of plant roots represented that we don't find today, but a whole bunch of other work that he's done on this type of material suggests that actually plant roots have evolved at least twice in different plant groups. So back to the idea that plants can tell us about plant evolution. This kind of preservation can tell us, details of cell biology, can tell us stuff that is, enriches our understanding of plant diversity. So it's really powerful stuff. Here's another of these, what I like to think of as cellular snapshots. This is, so on the left, that's from my garden before I put all my ferns back in my new garden. The plant that's nearest to the water butt there is the royal fern, Osmunda regalis. So it's actually a native plant in the UK, and it's a beautiful plant. On the right on this slide, you've got a Jurassic Osmunda silicified specimen. And if you look at all those different pictures there, so you've got cell level detail, you've got cell with nuclei, you've got chromosomes. If you look at D there, you've got chromosomal preservation within a Jurassic specimen. And again, it's got this wow factor, because actually you've got preservation on a scale that is extraordinary. So we can see that in various different places. So basically, where you find nice, exquisite preservation, we can say so much about these plants. Again, back to the Rhyniophytes. If we want to talk about exceptional moments of time captured in a fossil, I told you that the Rhyniophyte was preserved in those mineralizing fluids that probably became some sort of gel as they solidified and eventually became a chert, a really hard siliceous rock. This is a plant, the male organ of the plant releasing sperm cells. This is plant sex preserved from 400 million years ago. I mean, again, just extraordinary preservation on that cell level. So plant fossils, if you find the right preservation, can tell us extraordinary things. So that's stuff that the fossils can tell us directly, things about morphology and anatomy. We can also increasingly use those fossils to tell us stuff about plant evolution, or just being able to classify the plants through other means. A lot of the plants that we look at, and the things that I've looked at in those Isle of Wight beds, they're from extinct groups. So actually we don't have a modern counterpart to actually sort of talk about their biology or understand them, or even sort of construct them as a whole plant. One thing that I haven't talked about is the fact that palaeobotanists, because we are so used to working with bits of plants, we're used to looking at the leaves or looking at the cones or looking at the flowers. And you will know that out there in the real world, plants produce different organs at different times of the year and then discard them. So it's a fragmentary kind of science. We have to be detectives and build up our jigsaw puzzles. And part of that is, if we don't have a modern version of the plant, that's really tricky to do. And we don't know quite how all these plants relate to each other. There's a lot of work going on at the moment with using this process, FTIR, which is Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. It's an approach that allows you, it gives you basically a spectrographic signature for different materials. We can use this to look at that cuticle material that I told you about, that really resistant material that preserves really nicely. If we use this type of analysis, it will give us a signature, a graph that is unique for different cuticles. We can look at that and we can actually begin to classify, not on the basis of what the leaves look like, but on the basis of that preserved chemistry. So we call that chemotaxonomy, that classification of the plants and working out where they fit into the plant tree of life based on their chemical build-up that's still preserved in that cuticle. So again, don't worry about the details of this slide, merely to say that you can apply that to fossil cuticle as well as modern cuticle. So you've got modern plants on the left there, you've got fossil plants on the right there. And for some of the plants where we're really not sure where they fit, whether they're cycads, whether they're bennetypes, this could be a really useful way of doing it. And I've got a colleague at Nottingham, Barry Lomax, who's doing a similar approach, but he's doing it for looking at palaeontology. So that's the study of spores and pollen through deep time. And he's using this approach in the same way that the cuticle preserves really nicely. Plant spores and plant pollen are really resistant too, and you can use these approaches with those too. So that's going to be something that's really useful. It's not going to go away. I think there's going to be more and more work using these approaches. So finally, my last little appeal to you to think that maybe we should take more notice of plants, because I've already hopefully persuaded you that plant fossils are really useful. So I teach modern plant biology in my job at Nottingham, and within the plant biology community, we talk a lot about the idea of plant blindness, otherwise known as plant awareness disparity. This is the idea that people don't notice plants. People, when they're out and about, if you show people a picture of savanna grasslands, they won't notice the grasslands, they will notice the animal that's running in the foreground. And that's partly evolution. We are designed to notice things that might be a threat or things that are novel and moving. We haven't evolved to maybe notice plants as much. Although in some ways you can argue that actually that's actually in the long run more useful. And academics called Wandersee and Schuster, as recently as 1999, actually sort of crystallized those ideas in this definition here, plant blindness. Is plant blindness there when we look at how we look at fossils? I would argue it definitely is. And is that relevant to how we communicate about palaeobotany to people? I think it is. And when we communicate about life in deep time, reconstructions are really important to that. I could tell you, I could describe what the world in Lyme Regis 180 million years ago looked like, but if I showed you what we thought it looked like in a picture, you would probably pay a bit more attention to me. So should we care? whether plant blindness actually affects paleontology. I think we should. Let's look at it a little bit. So here's a relevant picture to the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival. This is the famous Duria Antiquior, that famous first paleo reconstruction by Henry de la Beche back in 1830. So my question to all of you who are looking at this, and some of you, this won't be a familiar picture, but for some of you it probably will be. Do you think there are any plants in this illustration? What do you think?
Yes.
Well, brilliant. Yes, you are right. If we open it up, yes, there are plants there on the land masses off to the left-hand side. And then off in the distance, you've got palm trees on those islands at the back as well. So from the very first paleo reconstructions, we know that the plants were part of the mix, and the people doing them felt it was important to do them. And yes, there's not a lot of detail in these plants, but the fact is they were there, and people were thinking in terms of the entire ecosystem and about reconstructing that. And in fact, if you move a little bit forwards in time from this time, by the time you're through to the 1840s and the 1850s, people are doing these beautiful reconstructions. So this is a coal measures scene. Look at the trunks of those club mosses there. This is all about the plants. This is exquisite detail. There's a few animals. I'll let you have the fish and the mollusks and things in the foreground there, but it's all about the plants. So there was a willingness to put the plants in the spotlight, and for it to be an equal sort of footing, if you like. It's also a time when people more generally, at the time there was a thing called pteridomania. People went crazy for ferns. It's like me today, but everybody doing it. So you've got this whole people, just normal people would go out and collect ferns. And I think that's part of what's driving these wonderful illustration in the middle of the 19th century, is that everybody cared a bit more about plant diversity, weirdly. And also it connected to the coal that everybody was very familiar with too. So I think there's a whole cultural thing there. But once upon a time, people really cared about fossil plants and about representing them. If you skip forwards a bit more in time, a fair jump this time. So this is the late 20th century, and this is my favourite book when I was little. This is the Ladybird Book of Dinosaurs. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it, and it's the versions that have appeared through time. This is my Wealden, so again the Lower Cretaceous in Dorset and on the Isle of Wight. And look at those illustrations. You've got things like Iguanodon and Hypsilophodon, and yes, this is dated, and yes, it's from the 70s, and we've learned a lot more, so don't worry about that bit of it. Think more about the representation of the plants. You've got bare earth everywhere. If you've got a herd of Iguanodon moving through this ecosystem, you would need the biomass of plants, and you would need the right plants with the right nutrition in them to feed that food pyramid. Luckily, we are moving on in time from that, but this is very much the representation of the 20th century. The dinosaurs are the actors, and the plants are is the backdrop. Is that kind of theatrical kind of thing. Nobody really cares about the plants. Someone's made a little bit of attempt, but we've moved on from that, I'm happy to say. If you then skip on to the sort of reconstructions that we can find, some artists really are trying, and actually this scene from Antarctica, I actually might, again, I'm asking, can you actually spot the dinosaur? Because there are so many beautiful plants doing their thing in this picture. Again, you've got ginkgos and araucaria, monkey puzzles, you've got all these different ferns. Give you a minute to actually see if you can spot that dinosaur in that illustration.
I see him.
Yay, well done. Takes a little bit though. Excellent. So we have artists like Mark Whitten, who not only, and you if you've been to James McKay's talk as well, you'll know a little bit more about how paleo artists work and how they endeavour to include scientific evidence in what they do. thinking about those plants with the same eye for accuracy that you do about the other elements, the animals in those environments as well. So I'm really hopeful, actually, we're going to enter another golden age where we do have paleo artists who are really representing plants fairly and actually thinking about plants in seasons and in events, and that they're not just the backdrop, if you like. Okay. So what I think we need to do is strike a balance. So look at these. This again, this is Jurassic. This is a monkey puzzle tree with some Archaeopteryx sitting on it. Feathered dino birds. Yeah, I think that's a debate for another day, isn't it? That's what I'd like to see. I'd just like to see a bit more representation of plants in their environment, and I think that would help to integrate everything. It would help people to think a little bit more about those food pyramids and thinking about a sensible, measured approach to how we can understand life in the past fully and how we can join it all up. Because plant fossils can tell us such a lot if we let them, and we include that information. So, thank you for your attention. It's been lovely to talk to you, and I hope that as things slowly and cautiously we emerge from everything that's happened, like this fern that's been through a disaster and yet it's still going, I hope that we'll all emerge from this and begin to do different things. If you've enjoyed this, I'm on Twitter. I do silly things. You'll have to ignore all the Doctor Who stuff. You'll just have to live with that. I'm Susie of Traken. If you want to listen to a piece of spoken word poetry that I did with a poet, Robin Lambol, we recently released an album full of science, poetry, spoken word stuff. And if you go into Bandcamp, you can listen to my track there, which is all about the stuff I've been telling you about collecting plant debris and then what it can tell you. So thank you for your attention, and I'm really happy to answer some questions if we've got some.
Thank you so much, Susie. It's really fascinating talking, and you say, you know, the way you deliver it is so passionate. It's fantastic. So
I'm a bit obsessed, aren't I?
We do have some questions.
Okay.
Noah would also like to show you something he's done from his garden as well. He thinks it might be fossilized plant material, so we'll get to that in a second. But
okay.
Matt has asked, what are the theories behind why plants were not as affected by the mass extinction events?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I talk about a fair bit with my students when I'm teaching this stuff. So plants have different ways of doing things. So we all have 2 copies of our chromosomes, and plants have this thing called polyploidy, where they can have multiple, many copies in some cases of their genetic information. And that means that they've got, so when the environment changes and they evolve, they've got multiple copies of genes that they can do different things with. So they're really good at evolving and adapting. All that stuff that I said about seeds and about spores, plants have, like this fern that I'm showing you here, plants can weather out extreme events better than a lot of animals can. So that's one reason. If you've got spores and or a seed bank, then the disaster passes and you know, a couple of decades and the plants can still return. So that's another reason. Yeah, it's that resilience, I think, really is the main thing. And the plants, because plants can't move away from environmental problems, they are quite good at adapting. And I think that's a big part of that story.
Great stuff. Thank you for that. I actually have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure thing.
There's plenty of examples nowadays of plants or insects that mimic their background, their plant life in the background. Yeah. Is there examples of that from deep past?
There are. I'm struggling to think of a direct example for you, but there are people who've pointed that out. There are people who've looked at, I think is it a ginkgo leaf? I can't remember. There is certainly something where if you, from the reconstruction, there's someone who's really arguing that there is mimicry there. Absolutely. Okay. I can't remember whether it's a ginkgo or it's a Benetite. I need to relook up that one, don't I? But yeah, no, in the same way, all of these tricks that we see in the modern world, things like mimicry, things like co-evolution, all these evolutionary ideas, they're there. I just think a lot of the time we're not geared up to look for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Well, I think while we're waiting for any more questions, we'll get to Noah, who'd like to show you.
Yeah.
If you could stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I will stop sharing. Absolutely.
And
right, there we go.
Oh, can you see Noah there?
I can see it. I can't see a lot of the detail though.
Let me just put him on. Let's get to unmute you and then.
Is this some fossilized plants?
It could be. Where did you find it, Noah?
I found it in my vegetable patch in the garden.
Really? Okay, where do you live, Noah?
I live in Bedworth.
Oh, okay. So it's a bit blurry. Can you move it a little bit away from the camera and we can see if we can see anything? Oh, there's lots of bits in it, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know, I can't really see from this what it is, but if you wanted, if an adult wanted to email me and send me some photos of it, I'm sure I could have a look and tell you what I think it might be. Would that be all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. But keep looking for things. Keep looking for fossils because it looks like you're doing a really good job. Well done.
Thanks, Noah, and thank you for joining all the sessions. You've been brilliant. Right, let's see if there's any more questions. That does seem to. Oh, here we go from Alan. Is there any idea? Is there an ideal balance between balance between CO2 and O2 demonstrating the Jurassic environment? If so, how far away is our planet from this equilibrium?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The fact that both CO2 and oxygen levels, I mean, they do change significantly through that deep time story that I told you. I think it's really difficult actually to sort of say what would be an ideal, because actually we can't rewind, and we have to, for our environment and the plants that we rely on to feed nearly 10 billion people on the planet by 2050, we have to rely on the current circumstances. I don't know how we're going to change that balance other than we just need to stop the CO2 rising at the rate it is. I mean, it's an unknown rate. There have been higher levels of CO2 in the past, but actually we're entering unknowns in terms of the speed of that change is outpacing evolution. In the past, that has never happened. That's the problem. We can't wait for the plants which sustain us all and the whole planet, and how all those cycles interact and how it all works. We're doing it at a speed that outpaces the planet's ability to cope with it without us intervening in our behaviours, if that makes sense. So yeah, there might be an ideal balance for the planet, but we need to think about how we do that without making humans miserable or even extinct.
Thank you. Oh, Vincent, just on the last part there, what fossil plants have been found at the poles?
Oh, that's a good question. So that Antarctic picture that I showed you. So Antarctic fossils have told us an awful lot. Plant fossils have told us an awful lot. We have stuff that fits into the big story about how we understand plate tectonics, and how that story of how we now understand that the plates move around the planet. Some of that evidence was from plant fossils which were found in the Antarctic, that actually you could see that different continents had the same plants, and so they must have all at one point all have been joined up in one big continent. At the time, that was a revolutionary idea, the idea of having Gondwana land as this big southern continent. So plants were really important to that. So key plants that are involved in that, you've got that whole Gondwana kind of flora. But likewise, that slide that I showed you of the Cretaceous and the Antarctic, and associated with that, you've also got these food webs where you have top predators. You have these carnivorous dinosaurs living in the Antarctic. It must have been dark for big chunks of the year, and yet the climate was such that you had that lush plant material. So in that illustration from the Cretaceous, and again, I'm a Mesozoic person, so that's the one I can talk about with more confidence. you've got those ginkgos and all those diverse types of fern present. You've got conifers, you've got all these Mesozoic, Mesophytic plant groups that are still around us today, most of them, not all of them, but most of them. So lots of different fossil plants, yeah, from across the planet, but yeah, Antarctic as well.